We're continuing our study in the book of 1 Corinthians this morning, and we have worked our way up to the middle of chapter 7. We're now ready to start in chapter 7, verse 25. But before we go there, just a little brief reminder about what has gone before. So, in the first part of chapter 7, Paul addressed the questions that the Corinthian church had sent him in a letter. And through the rest of the book of Corinthians, starting from chapter 7, Paul addresses point by point the questions that the church members raised in this letter. And the first question that they asked at the beginning of chapter 7 was, what about marriage? Is it okay to get married as a Christian? And they wanted to know, what if one partner becomes a Christian but the other partner doesn't become a Christian? How should they think about that? And Paul encouraged them, if you're married, stay married. If your unsaved partner will continue to live with you in a married relationship, stay married. Don't break that marriage. God wants to encourage marriage and so on. So now we come this morning to the second point Paul addresses concerning unmarried young single people. So this here we have in verse 25. 1 Corinthians verse 25, Paul starts, now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that has obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful. So what he's saying here is these young, unmarried people, Paul is about to give them some advice. This is not a commandment. He's not telling them what to do, but he merely wants to share some advice as a person who has obtained the mercy of the Lord, as a person who is fit to give uncular advice. And young people need this kind of wisdom in their lives. I remember my own youth, my own trials and relationships, going through my teenage years. When I was in high school, I didn't make the best decisions with my relationships. I had a girlfriend. I liked the girl. She had a lot of charms. But my mother didn't think she was a good fit for me. And my mother was kind of quiet about it. She didn't say very much. But once in a while she would drop these hints. But I was kind of slow on the uptake. I didn't realize what my mother was trying to get at. But my mom was kind of a hands-off person. And so we went off to college. My girlfriend and I went to separate colleges. And at the end of my first semester of college, I got the Dear John letter that my mom knew this was coming, but I had no idea. My heart was broken. I was crushed. This girl had found another boyfriend. I was just a summer fling, it turns out, for her. I had ideas of getting married on my mind. She had other ideas. It would have been good to get some wise counsel, but at that time I didn't have anybody in my life to turn to for counsel. But Paul here is giving his counsel to these young, unmarried people. And he's not telling them what to do, but he's telling them what to think about. So these are things you need to think about as you're getting involved with a potential marriage partner. He starts here in verse 26. I suppose, therefore, that it is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man to be so. So I suppose. So this is a kind of an old way of saying. We wouldn't say that today. I suppose we would say something more along the lines of, in my opinion, considering these current stressful circumstances, I think it's better to remain single. That's how to think about this verse. I suppose is something my mom used to say, I suppose, when I would want to do something that she wouldn't have endorsed, but she didn't see it as something that was I shouldn't do. She said, do I want to do this? I suppose so. So Paul says, I suppose you could get married, but I think it's better for this present distress that you stay single. Verse 27. Art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. So if you've pursued the marriage relationship, if you have that underway, Paul says, you don't need to break off if you're bound. But if you're not bound, then think carefully. But if thou marry, thou hast not sinned, and if a virgin marry, she hath not sinned, nevertheless shall have much trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. So what Paul's saying here is, it's not a sin to get married. Being married is not necessarily outside of the will of God for your life. For a man or a woman to get married. But Paul wants to bear in mind that if they get married, they will have trouble. This marriage will bring stress into your life. And you have to think about that ahead of time. You have to think about that before you get married. You have to realize the stress that comes before you get married and be ready to accept that responsibility. Be ready to take on the responsibility of a wife and children. When you're young and you have a girlfriend and you were thinking about getting married, it might seem like all fun and games in the beginning. You could just go and do as you want. You have somebody to do things with and a built-in buddy. But there's responsibility that comes with this marriage. This is what Paul's trying to explain. You have to think about those things. But Paul says, but I spare you, meaning he doesn't want to go on ad nauseum telling them about the troubles that they're going to have in the flesh. So he's going to spare them. He's going to spare them too much discussion about that. But he does want to continue here, verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time is short. It remaineth that both they that had wives be as though they had none, that they that weep as though they wept not, they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, they that buy as though they possess not. What Paul's saying here is trouble is coming. And the reason he's giving this advice is because the Roman world at that time was in turmoil. The turmoil was just around the corner. The current emperor at this time was probably when this letter was written, was probably the Emperor Claudius. Now Claudius had a series of failed marriages. He had, I don't know how many, can't remember how many wives he had. I think 3, but I don't know for sure. With one of his wives, he had a son named Britannicus. Then that marriage fell apart. Then he married another woman, and the new wife already had a son from a prior relationship, and so he adopted the son, and the son's name was Nero, and Nero was older than his stepbrother. Well, the marriage between Nero's mother and the emperor fell on hard times. They were having a falling out. It was kind of an open secret that their marriage, the emperor's marriage, was struggling. And Claudius suddenly dies. He was in his mid-60s. And suddenly one night he takes violently ill and dies. And historians speculate that his wife poisoned him in order to get her son, Nero, on the throne. So Nero ascends to the throne, and he promptly kills his stepbrother, has his stepbrother murdered. And a little while later, he kills his mother and he kills his wives, and he's an unhappy person. He was 16 when he came to power, 16 years old, and he was kind of an unstable person. And so the Roman Empire, was in turmoil over all these circumstances. Some 10 years later, in 64, Rome is going to burn down, and historians speculate that Nero set the fire, burned Rome so he could accomplish his building projects. And that is when the persecution of the Christians began in earnest after the fire in the mid-60s. And Paul anticipates these things. Paul anticipates all this turmoil, and what he tells young believers is think about these things before you get married. And in this section here, brethren, I say the time is short. It remaineth that both they that had wives be as though they had none. And what Paul is saying is this. So when this intense pressure comes, you can't live life like you did in peaceful times. When the intense pressure is there, your priorities change. You focus on staying alive. You focus on staying out of prison. You can't attend to your wife and family. In fact, if you have kids, in peacetime, children are a blessing. But in times of war and turbulence, children can be a great heartache because you worry for the safety of your children. That puts a burden on your heart to worry for your kids. And he says, and they that weep as though they wept not. When you're in war, you don't have time to mourn losses. And though that rejoice as though they rejoice not. When you're in war, you don't have time to celebrate victories. And they that buy as though they possess not. You don't have time to enjoy property. You don't think about going to the supermarket or to the mall or to invest in property or things to do with the future. It's just here and now in these stressful, turbulent times. And they that use this world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passes away. So we wouldn't say something like that. We would phrase that differently today. And they that use this world is not abusing. So we would say something more along these lines. Make the most of your time. Or make the most of your time. Don't waste your time. If you replace the word world with time, you may get a better sense of the meaning. For they that use this time, not abusing your time, not wasting your time. So make the most of your time. For this world is passing away. I remember my grandfather fought in World War II. He saw 60 days, more than 60 days of actual combat. He was in the front lines, dodging bullets for more than 2 months. Now my grandfather entered the war after or around the time that they crossed the Rhine River in Germany. They were pushing the Germans back through Germany. He was an army ranger. And they would go up to a village. They would approach this village from the woods, and they would wait overnight. And overnight, the artillery would shell the village, would shoot shells over their head into the village to soften up the village. And then in the very early morning hours, my grandfather would take the men into the village and clear the village of the German soldiers. And they would go into this house to house fighting. It was very intense. He said some of his buddies were killed by booby traps. And he sensed the booby traps. He said he had a sixth sense for these booby traps. That when he would walk up a set of stairs, that he just didn't step on a certain step. He didn't open a certain door. He just was scared of these booby traps, and he was aware of them. And the German snipers would be trying to shoot his men as he was traveling through these villages. And he told one story one time of he was walking between the buildings and a dog jumped out, hidden behind this building. The dog, he says he jerked his pistol and shot the dog in midair and didn't even miss a step in his walking around. He was so focused on staying alive. And he said he remembers receiving an Easter card from my grandmother. There he was in his soldiers' camp. The mess would come up every once in a while. Every week or so they would get food rations. And when mess came up, they gave him the mail drop, and he had this card, and he looked I didn't even know what Easter was. He couldn't even remember his wife, his kids, my father and his brother at home, 2 little kids. He didn't know, he had no idea what month it was, what day it was. He was only focused on staying alive. That was his entire focus. It absolutely absorbed him. And that's what Paul is saying here, that in these stressful times, you're not going to be able to enjoy the things that you enjoy during normal times. So Paul continues here, verse 32, but I would have you without carefulness, without cares, in other words, without cares for this world. He that is unmarried cares for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. Verse 33, but he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife. So when you get married, more responsibility comes on you, and you have to attend more to your mate. Verse 34, the same thing applies to women. That's what he says here, verse 34. There is difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, and how she may please her husband. So Paul says, if you can stay single, think about that before you get married. Verse 35, and this I speak for your own profit. It is profitable. He wants them to benefit from his words. Not that I may cast a snare upon you. A snare. Paul doesn't want to unduly burden them, but he wants them to think about these things for their profit. But for that which is comely, he doesn't want to cast a snare upon them, but he speaks these things, but that for which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. So Paul desires that they find fulfillment in the Lord. A lot of people have the idea that they can't be fulfilled unless they have a marriage partner, unless they're married. But Paul says, no, you can find fulfillment in the Lord. You can put your focus in the Lord and have a very fulfilling life. But it's not a commandment. It's just things that he encourages young people to think about before they get married. Continuing in verse 36. But if any man think that he behave himself uncomely towards his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. So this verse, the commentators are split as to whether this is talking about the father of the virgin or someone who is a young man considering marrying a virgin. I tend to lean towards the idea that this is addressed to the father, to the virgin's father. That the father of this young woman doesn't want to stand in the way if the woman wants to get married. In other words, if she passed the flower of her needs and needs so require, so the father is no longer able to take care of the daughter, or some circumstances happen that the daughter has the opportunity to marry well, and it's a sensible marriage, then Paul tells that father, let him do what he will. Let the couple get married. Don't stand in their way. It makes sense in some situations for this daughter to get married. If there are some extenuating circumstances, take that into account and let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, in other words, the person feels confident that the girl would be better off not married for the reasons that he's said above, having no necessity, there's no need to get married, there's no necessity, but hath power over his own will, he has a clear conscience about it, and has a decree in his heart that he will keep his virgin do as well. And what he's saying is sometimes it makes sense to marry the daughter, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to marry the daughter off, to let the daughter get married. So it depends on the circumstances of your life, of the situation of the family. And Paul's just encouraging us to think about these things in relation to serving the Lord. how we should approach all of life. It's instruction for major decisions that we have in our life. Think about how this is going to affect your walk with the Lord and possibly your family and your neighbors and the friends around you. Verse 38. So then, he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better. It's okay to stay single. To be single is just perfectly fine. The wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives. So the wife must stay married if she's married, bound by law. But if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married whom she will, only in the Lord. When you're looking for a marriage partner, you want to be yoked with somebody who has the same values that you do, approaches life from the same point of view that you do. A Christian. If you're a Christian, you want to marry a Christian. Marry in the Lord. And Paul's last piece of advice as chapter 7 closes, but she is happier if she so abides, in other words, if she stays single, after my judgment. So Paul's saying that, in my opinion, again, I think she will be happier to remain single. And Paul says, I think also that I had the Spirit of God. So Paul is speaking as an apostle. He has a gift. He has insights from the Lord. The mercies of the Lord, he said in verse 25, have come on him. And so he offers these things not as commands, but as sensible things to think about as you move through life and you make these major important decisions about marriage in your life. Hallelujah.